Warning, this video broaches the topics of obsessive-compulsive disorder, violent and unpleasant intrusive thoughts, and suicidal ideation. If those topics are potentially triggering for you at the moment, I suggest skipping this video for now. You can always come back to it later when you are ready. I promise. Obsessive-compulsive disorder is often misunderstood by those who do not experience it. In our media and pop culture obsessed world, people with OCD are often portrayed as ultra-clean and organized perfectionists, and at our most cliched, we are germaphobes who must wash our hands clean like a guilt-ridden Lady Macbeth. Yet the reality for many OCD-afflicted folks can be much different. While sure there are people with OCD who are germaphobes and are impeccably organized, there are many who do not fit this criteria, and one of those said OCD folks is me, because on the whole, I'm not a germaphobe, and I ain't the most organized. If anything, I'm a filthy pig, and my room is a disaster, because let's be honest here, my room looks as if it has been ravaged by an F5 tornado or a private detective desperately searching for evidence, meaning that I honestly upend the popular interpretation of what OCD looks like, because I'm a depressed rebel, and I break all the stereotypes. Overall, my OCD is just a bit more inward and psychological, affecting how I view people, how I control my thoughts, and how I approach media. In fact, especially in how I approach media. Mostly because movies, games, TV, and music are all important aspects of my identity, so of course my obsessive-compulsive neurodivergent brain approaches these items in a different way than compared to someone with a neurotypical way of thinking. There is a clear contrast here. To explain my OCD, let me first post a definition on obsessive-compulsive disorder in general. See, OCD is a severe anxiety disorder subtype. Per a definition from the Mayo Clinic, no relation, obsessive-compulsive disorder features a pattern of unwanted thoughts and fears, which are obsessions that lead you to do repetitive behaviors, which are compulsions. These obsessions and compulsions interfere with daily activities and cause significant stress. You may try to ignore or stop your obsessions, but that only increases your distress and anxiety. Ultimately, you feel driven to perform compulsive acts to try to ease your stress. Despite efforts to ignore or get rid of the bothersome thoughts or urges, they keep coming back. This leads to more ritualistic behavior, the vicious cycle of OCD." End quote. Now, these obsessions and compulsions can be several things. The most obvious example is that aforementioned germophobia or perfectionist tendencies, the type of stuff that gets a lot of focus in movies, TV shows, and other mediums because it's honestly a way that OCD can be visually tangible. It's a behavior that can be seen, which ultimately translates well to visual artistic mediums. But with that being said, what happens when that OCD is something that is more internal, something that is harder to see if you don't know what you're looking for? Well, then you kind of have a case like mine, though admittedly my case didn't begin as something so different. After all, in my early and mid-teens, I got incredibly anxious when my hands got dirty. I got afraid whenever my hands got messy after playing with markers or accidentally touching bird poop. Don't ask. I was afraid that my hands had been contaminated in a way that could lead to my death, because obviously bird shit is what will ultimately get me in the end. My tombstone will say Riley Constantine was smited by bird shite, because obviously. But these anxieties were only the beginning and spiraled into bigger overall fears about death. In fact, as an early teenager, there were lengthy periods of time where I believed that I would die within the next few weeks of a given obsessive thought. In fact, many times I obsessed and stressed over the idea that I had contaminated my body with too many McDonald's cheeseburgers and that on a specific day during class, I would just keel over and die, which, did not actually happen yet. And yes, I know that fear was silly. Hell, even back then, a part of me knew that my fears over my mortal demise were unfounded and that my brain was on some bullshit. But still, like any true American, I remain undeterred when it came to letting fear run my life. And thus, the fears and anxieties over my death persisted even though I didn't want them to, even though I didn't necessarily believe these thoughts, because ultimately I was obsessed and couldn't stop thinking about my mortal demise. My brain just wouldn't and couldn't stop thinking about it, which was painful. However, while this is an example of severe anxiety and an obsession, you might be wondering where the compulsions are within this mental health fruit cocktail. After all, the illness is called obsessive-compulsive disorder, so where do those compulsions fit in on my neurological equation? Well, to answer, we have to look at my environment, and my environment is that I lived in a fairly religious Greek Orthodox household, and my earlier signs of compulsions definitely had a religious bent. In fact, I privately prayed to God to make sure that I was okay, which did offer me some some comfort at those given moments, yet those aforementioned moments were often negated by the vicious cycle of OCD. A vicious cycle where this compulsion would only lessen my anxiety for a limited amount of time, rather than outright eliminating those aforementioned fears permanently, meaning that those fears about my death would always come back with a vengeance, because my compulsive praying only temporarily quelled those obsessions rather than outright eliminate them. And to make matters worse, my OCD eventually corrupted and contaminated my compulsions as well. See, earlier in my life I once found comfort in praying to God, but eventually a new obsession evolved and captivated my attention. And that obsession was, what if my soul is impure? What if my very being is contaminated and when I die, I don't go to heaven, but instead go to hell? And for that, I worried. What if I burn in those fires forever? What if I'm forced to spend an eternity with Ronald Reagan? For a while, I was just afraid of damnation, which then caused me to fret and obsess over any rule I had broken or any sin I had committed in the past. In fact, one time I accidentally said the words "God damn it," and then I worried that saying "God damn it" would damn me to hell. And then there was the fact that I worried when it came to illegally downloading music off of LimeWire, because of course this was the 2000s, but instead of having more valid concerns about the usage of LimeWire, like how me trying to download Slayer's Decade of Aggression overall murdered the family computer, because you know, LimeWire was my computer slayer, if you will, I often paled with fear when I realized that I was technically stealing, causing me to fear that my need to download Drowning Pool's bodies would send me to the realm of eternal torment, which would not be a good time for me. And then there were the obsessions revolving around the whole cluster when it came to gender identity and how I secretly wanted to be a girl and wear my sister's clothes, i.e. something that I thought went against the will of God. I obsessed over the fact that my internal feminine desires went against God's design, which, you know, kind of f***ed me up a little bit, which was something that caused me to repress my feminine feelings, all to the point that it traumatized me and caused those aforementioned feminine feelings to become a whole separate personality for a bit, you know, because it was just not a good time for me. And as a result, regardless of which rule I broke or which sin I may have committed, I felt compelled to continue to pray for God for forgiveness, for him to cleanse my soul of its quote-unquote sins. Admittedly, I had other obsessions in this era of my life, as well as after it, many of which were paranoia surrounding how the government was watching me and even had a file on me for whatever reason. Because, you know, if you're mentally ill and paranoid, you'll believe anything when it comes to whether or not the government is watching you, because it's definitely a fear that I had, but I'm honestly glossing over this obsession because we need to get back to the topic of how OCD relates to my consumption of movies, video games, TV, and etc. So to wit, I have always been a fan of movies, games, TV, and such. They offered me a great escape outlet and a sense of fun that OCD had otherwise sucked out of my life. They gave me joy, but there was a problem here, mostly because my OCD would eventually infect these items that I enjoyed as well. See, as a kid, negative criticism or pointing out plot holes in something like Star Wars or the Lord of the Rings trilogy made me anxious, mostly because the idea that something that I loved could potentially have an imperfection gave me profound anxiety, all to the point that I would become obsessed with those said imperfections. Like in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, for example, the plot hole regarding how the Fellowship could have just flown the Eagles into Mordor emotionally wrecked me for a while. In fact, for a time, it contaminated my view of the trilogy to the point that even though I know I loved the trilogy, the series itself gave me anxiety because I couldn't stop thinking about those damn Eagles. I hate the Eagles, man. And with this plot hole, it just made me associate this property, the one that I loved, with fear and anxiety. And ultimately, these thoughts, whether we're talking about Lord of the Rings or anything else, as silly and as inconsequential as they were, hurt me. They caused me to associate things I enjoyed with feelings of dread. Of course, those obsessions were only half of the story when it came to my early life media consumption, because overall, we still need to discuss the compulsions. And to be honest, my compulsions in regards to something like the Eagles and the Lord of the Rings were actually similar to my other early life compulsions in regards to non-media topics, in that I needed to talk them out. Though with the ones regarding death and damnation, I talked to God, whereas with the media criticisms, I talked with friends and family, which, like the other compulsions, overall lessened my anxiety for a time, all before eventually roaring back. They ultimately never fixed the problem, hence why my OCD regarding my media consumption proceeded to get worse and affected more tangible real-life things as well. And for for an example of this, let's talk about the Xbox 360. See, in my mid-teens, I loved my Xbox 360. After all, gaming was one of my favorite pastimes as a kid, and seeing as I was a teenager by the time the Xbox 360 released, I was then able to play more games that were rated M for mature. Some of them good, some of them less good. Regardless of game though, I really enjoyed my new shiny loud computer box at the time, but of course my OCD brain turned this love against me. In fact, I started to become worried and obsessed that I wouldn't be allowed to play my 360 anymore, or that the Xbox would become broken, though not because of the ubiquitous red ring of death, mind you, because of course that was an actual thing that happened that caused people's consoles to brick, but rather that for whatever reason my Xbox would be taken away from me, or that my newly born nephew would destroy it. Hell, I was at one time convinced that my nephew was placed on this earth by God, also that he could destroy my Xbox 360 as a form of divine retribution, hence why my compulsions forced me to set 2 child gates in front of the room that the Xbox was in, and then there was the fact that when not in use, I'd store the console and all the games high up on a shelf as if it were a fairy tale princess forced to live in the tallest tower, because the sanctity of my maiden Xbox 360 just cannot be sullied, god damn it. But regardless, I sought to protect my Xbox 360. As a compulsion, I repeatedly asked my mom that my Xbox was not going to be taken away from me, or that she would keep a close eye on my nephew while I was away. I was just unhealthily obsessed, and yes, deep down, I knew that my obsessive anxieties were unfounded, that everything would ultimately be alright, because we're just talking about a video game console after all. But still, I just couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop agonizing over the idea that I would lose my Xbox. After all, my Xbox 360 was something that gave me joy and happiness, and I had this fear and anxiety that I would lose it. This obsession over losing my Xbox 360 was another example of how OCD can contaminate something that I enjoy, similar to how I dwelled about the Eagles plot hole whenever rewatching the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and thus having anxious feelings when I used to talk about those movies. I began to associate my Xbox 360 with anxiety, with fear, because mentally speaking, my love of the system had become contaminated, because as much as I loved the Xbox 360, I at best had an undercurrent of anxiety while playing it, and at worst, obsessed about it all day and every day. And I did that for a time that spanned 2 to 3 years, which was just not fun for me. But things would soon get worse. See, my anxiety surrounding the purity of my soul was occurring at the same time as these Xbox 360 obsessions, meaning that these two obsessions often intermingled in very bizarre ways. For one thing, even though I didn't believe it, I was obsessed over the idea that playing video games would make me a more violent person, and that there was something inherently sinful about playing those aforementioned violent video games. Additionally, I'd get obsessed with some overall even sillier stuff, like in how the doors in Gears of War looked vaguely religious, and I was very anxious due to how Marcus Phoenix very forcefully opened them. Because obviously, I was just very concerned that Marcus Phoenix was actually kicking down the house of God. Because wow, my brain really stretched over some of these obsessions, all to the point that I wish that mental gymnastics was an actual Olympic sport, because when it comes to playing that, I'd get a f***ing gold medal. It'd be my first trophy. But these worries eventually became more sinister. In my late teens and early 20s, I became less religious. I became less concerned about damnation. But with that said, my OCD still persisted and took on a more frightening form. See, my obsessive compulsive disorder transitioned from having a religious bent and instead focused on morality itself, and I fretted over whether or not I was a good person. And this obsession affected my media consumption. See, when playing one of the Gears of War sequels, amidst chainsawing someone in multiplayer, a thought and an image struck me. What if it was one of my relatives that got chainsawed? Keep in mind, I loved that relative and didn't and don't have a desire to hurt them. Yet after playing that game, I had this gruesome image of my relative being eviscerated. And after that, I immediately felt guilt and shame. After all, how could I think something like that? Am I a monster? Am I evil? What the f***? Brain. I didn't want to think that thought, yet still my OCD mind persisted. I just couldn't stop dwelling on my relative dying a gruesome death via Gears of War chainsaw bayonet. And from there, a new era of obsessions began. In fact, a lot of the time when watching or playing a violent movie or game, I'd imagine the people I cared about being gruesomely killed in the same way as in that said movie or game. For one example, I saw The Revenant with a family member and imagined all the horrible and painful things happening to Leo DiCaprio were also actually occurring to that aforementioned family member, which was honestly a bunch of mental images that were probably a more disturbing movie-going experience than the filmmakers of the Revenant intended, which is saying something because that film was sadistic as fuck. But regardless of whether we are discussing The Revenant or something else, these morbid obsessions were distressing because I obviously didn't want to dwell on vile thoughts where my family members were getting hurt, yet I couldn't stop. Hell, I couldn't even indulge in my compulsion to confess because I was way too terrified to tell anyone about these violent thoughts, lest they know how evil and up I am, lest they think that I'm a monster. Things eventually deteriorated even further. While I had vile thoughts regarding my family members and friends being hurt all the way until the year that I was diagnosed with OCD in 2016, hell, my previous examples involving obsessions revolving around the Revenant occurred at the tail end of that, the vast majority of my obsessions evolved into something much more sinister. In fact, these undesired and intrusive violent thoughts eventually made me an active participant, that the person harming the people that I care about wasn't an esoteric version of someone else. Instead, I imagined myself committing these atrocities, all to the point that these unwanted thoughts about hurting my loved ones and the sense of personal moral shame surrounding those aforementioned thoughts became the norm for me. Despite being repulsed by these ideas, they became automatic thoughts. Hell, I didn't even need to watch, play, or listen to movies, games, TV shows, or music to get my OCD brain chemistry triggered here. If anything, these thoughts became a part of my standard operating procedure, even despite how I didn't want them and found them distressing. They became automatic thoughts that plagued my mental psyche, especially during family gatherings and holidays, because of course, seeing all the people I loved in one place triggered a flood of these awful violent images into my mind. Cutthroats, shootings, you name it. In the 2010s, these gatherings were not fun, especially when it was Christmas. But if you can believe it, things eventually got even worse for me, mostly because my thoughts of personal shame went beyond violent thoughts as well. In fact, whenever seeing someone, whether if I knew them or not, I began having unwanted and untrue negative thoughts about those aforementioned people. And admittedly, these intrusive thoughts that I had were so vile and gross that I'm honestly too nervous to discuss them here. Like, just imagine the most mean-spirited and grotesque things and multiply them by 10. Because honestly, if you can conjure the most awful thought into your mind, rest assured that I've probably thought of it and that it was probably worse. My brain was just that bad. And of course, I didn't want to think these thoughts, because I didn't actually believe in them or desire to dwell on them, but rather these horrific mental images were stuck in my noggin, all due to the fact that they caused me to have an immense sense of shame and guilt. These obsessions had the effect of making me feel like a really shitty person, unworthy of love, kindness, or anything nice. I felt impure. I believed that I was a horrible person because obviously normal good people don't have these problems. They do not think these awful thoughts. They do not obsess over things so damn horrific and just downright nasty. Their very being isn't morally contaminated like how I am. Now, while all of that happened, my media consumption, whether movies, video games, or whatever, declined. Even though I loved media, my interest in it was forced into the background. And the reason for this was due to a lot of media criticism on YouTube. See, in the 2010s, I was a big fan of Nostalgia Critic, Red Letter Media, and to a lesser extent, CinemaSins, all channels that really focus and feed on negativity and cynicism, because truly, it's the type of content that is prioritized by the almighty algorithm. May the content last forever. And these types of reviews, video essays, and comedic videos really heighten my OCD patterns in regards to media, as if it were my very own spider sense. If that aforementioned spider sense made me miserable. In fact, whenever watching a movie or a game, I would see flaws and problems in everything, and often became obsessed with them. Even trivial bullshit that didn't matter. I just couldn't stop thinking about these issues, real or just perceived. And while yes, this obsession is similar to my early life obsessions to topics like the Eagles and the Lord of the Rings, these obsessions that I had in my early to mid-20s were a lot more severe, mostly because they coincided with online film reviewers and such that went to great lengths to overanalyze narrative inconsistencies, plot holes, and gaffes, all to the point that these online critics validated my base fears and anxieties. It kind of felt like my hang-ups had a point all along, which was ridiculous because I honestly don't really have that perspective anymore. If anything, I believe that emotional storytelling, like what feels right in the narrative at any given moment, is more important than any logical inconsistency or plot hole, because the Eagles and I be cool now. But this just wasn't the case in my early to mid-20s when my OCD was really heightened, something that many online negative critics did not help with. And while sure, negative reviews and such are still important and valid aspects of media criticism, the way in which YouTube's media reviewing populace heavily favors the negative is just not a good thing, both for artistic criticism itself and, more relevant to the topic of this video essay, my OCD at the time. It was just honestly not healthy for me. And due to this, I eventually lost interest in media itself for a while because I could no longer see the good in them. I just saw the problems. Another issue to add on top of this bullshit cake came in the form of my battle with my gender identity. In the 2010s, also for the sake of being more simplistic, I'm sidestepping the issue of my dissociative identity disorder here because that's just another topic entirely. I realized that I was probably transgender and identified as a woman. And the operative word there was probably, mostly because my OCD and my anxiety always gave me doubts. While sure, I remembered how in my early childhood that I dreamt about being a girl and that I always felt jealous over girls and women, I couldn't get over the idea that I was a fake, that I wasn't really transgender, that maybe I was just some sort of perversion, like fried Twinkies or the conductor of the Polar Express, because I don't care how whimsical that film is, an old man is abducting children. But anyway, the point. I was obsessed over the idea of self-doubt, which really turned ugly after one of my attempts to come out. See, back in 2015, I came out to a close figure in particular, but instead of accepting me off the bat, they forced me to question myself further. They denied my identity by saying that I was not trans and asked if I really believed I was one of those people, which were statements that ultimately shamed me back into the closet and are events that caused me extreme pain just discussing them today because no f***ing shit, it was awful. Yet those words had an effect on me. I began to doubt myself, much in the way that was similar to an obsession, to the point that I shoved my desires and need to be a woman away for a while. I tried to live as a guy, which was ultimately not the life for me. It was a horrible time. Eventually, my undiagnosed OCD caused all of my issues and obsessions to come to a head in the November of 2015, because honestly, it was one of the worst moments of my life. Mostly because, in regards to my relationship with OCD, I reached the end game. In fact, on one early winter morning, I became obsessed with the idea that everything was pointless, that the world would one day end due to a variety of cataclysmic disasters, and due to this, the point of existence would be moot, and that life in the meantime had no purpose. And add on the fact that I couldn't stop thinking ideas that I would hurt the people that I cared about, that I forced myself to dwell on a future where I would spend the rest of my life as a man, or that I couldn't even use movies or games as a distraction, seeing as I was obsessed with all of their own real or perceived imperfections. There was just no joy in my life at the time. There was no happiness. Just pain. It was at that moment that I considered suicide. Even though deep down I didn't want to die, I became obsessed with my potential death, both because maybe that's what a guilty and impure person like myself deserved, and also because maybe then I could be at peace. Maybe I could make the pain stop. And honestly, I was obsessed with those thoughts for roughly 3 months until I realized that something needed to change. I had to get help. I had to check myself into the hospital for the second time. I had gone to one roughly a year prior, where I got diagnosed with bipolar 2, but some aspect of my mental health clearly snuck through the cracks there. And in an effort to get stabilized, I agreed to go to a hospital for the second time, and I stayed there for about half a month, a time I spent trying to learn what was wrong with my brain. And of course, I learned that I have OCD, a diagnosis that was very enlightening for me, mostly because I learned that other people can have disturbing thoughts like I do, but where I obsess over these macabre mental images and feel immense guilt and shame over them, the vast majority of people can shrug them off as big ol' nothing burgers, just like whatever McDonald's shoves into their quote-unquote meat patties. And from there I received extensive therapy and medications that allowed me to start the process of getting my internal mental health shit in line. I finally had hope. However, the road to recovery is long and is a process both containing lots of steps progressing forward and some regressing backward, which for someone starting at square one is very intimidating. After all, at the time of my diagnosis, I didn't necessarily have the mental health tools at my disposal in order to combat my OCD symptoms. Hell, even the medication didn't help all that much at first, due to how I had to take a high dose continuously for at least a month in order to get the maximum effect out of the medication, which meant that in the meantime, I needed reasons to hold on for dear life. I had to remember what was important to me, which the most obvious things were the people that I loved, like my family and friends. Because sure, even if I didn't desire to live for myself, I needed to survive for their sakes. I couldn't willingly force them to experience an existence sans Riley. After all, if I am not around, how else will no one understand all of my heavy metal references? Like, how could I possibly deny my friends, family, and acquaintances of near incoherent ramblings about the legacy of Death's Human, the importance of Fear Factory's demanufacture, or the heavenly sound of cattle decapitation. To deprive my loved ones of that would be inhumane. But joking aside, I was originally motivated to live and survive because I did not want to cause those I loved any pain or anguish if I were to end it all. So despite the pain, I needed to keep living my life for them. My mental health slowly but surely improved during my hospital stay. As I received therapy and as the medication eventually started to take effect, my interest in media was rekindled. In fact, I rediscovered my love for storytelling and media by reading The Wheel of Time, i.e. the high fantasy series by the late author Robert Jordan, no relation, during my stay at the hospital. Although of course I did not read the entirety of the series while I was in the hospital, because that series is 15 books long. I'd need more time than just half a month, to be fair. But still, during my stay, I read the first 2.5 books, which reminded me why stories and narratives matter to me. After all, one of the Wheel of Time's main storylines is about a man who is essentially a mental health time bomb due to how fantastical magical shenanigans are slowly but surely driving him insane, which, I could relate, because mental health themes, because obviously, it resonated with me. Furthermore, reading The Wheel of Time reminded me of why I love artistic mediums to begin with. The books reminded me that entertainment could simultaneously be both escapist and personally relatable, and that's something that I carried with me once I eventually departed the hospital in favor of home. In fact, when returning home, I was not content to just devour the rest of the Wheel of Time series, though I eventually did do that. It was awesome. But instead, I wanted to start playing games and seeing movies again. I wanted to reinvigorate my interests in media, which was overall a good thing, even if it was easier said than done. See, prior to the hospital stay, motivating myself to enjoy entertainment was difficult. After all, I was in so much pain that the only thing I desired to do all day was to sleep, because of course losing consciousness whilst inside a blanket burrito was the only way I could really escape the pain for a while. And now after getting home, it was tempting to go back to bad habits, because even though I was receiving treatment and had a diagnosis, my illness was still present, meaning that sleeping all day was very tempting for me. But of course, I persevered, playing many games and watching movies to the point that my love for them was rekindled due to the earlier mentioned fact that I related to them. Hell, the first film that I saw in a movie theater once leaving the hospital was Robert Eggers' art house horror film The Witch, which was a movie that I strongly connected with because the main character's obsession with moral purity was reminiscent to my own struggles with OCD. And despite the fantastical horror elements with The Witch, I understood what the lead character was going through to a certain extent. And honestly, this was a transformative experience for me, which then inspired me to start a YouTube channel. Though let me be clear, that YouTube channel is not this one, because I deleted the old one. Because in terms of quality, my first YouTube channel was rougher than Korg's ass cheeks. But still, seeing movies and playing games got my creative ball rolling again, and eventually led to this YouTube channel that you're watching today. It's how I improved. Of course, the process of becoming an overall mentally healthier person wasn't an easy or a straightforward process. In fact, there were a lot of setbacks. I would eventually be hospitalized for a third time, I participated in intensive outpatient groups twice, and I would need to learn new therapies in order to get my mind into a healthier state, as well as change my automatic thought patterns. Yet, thankfully, with a lot of hard work, I was able to become a better version of myself. I was able to process my intense emotions better. I realized that my hurtful thoughts were just thoughts and didn't reflect my actions. I came to the conclusion that my desire to be a woman was real, and to add on, the person that originally shamed me into the closet eventually became supportive of me as well. And then, in terms of media consumption, I accepted the fact that every piece of art is subjective and has its own strengths and flaws. Through medication and understanding that these thoughts were an issue of my brain chemistry rather than a factual formation of coherent thoughts, I could finally enjoy a movie or a game, even despite how my uncontrollable mind would try to throw criticisms at those aforementioned movies or games in order to make me feel like shit, just like a Chicago Bears fan. But here's the thing, these thoughts no longer work on me, mostly because with my new mental health tools, I was able to work through the thoughts that I couldn't control, and I eventually came out on the other side and would still enjoy the stories that I loved. And now with my brain chemistry being under better control, I no longer really obsess on the negatives in films, TV shows, games, or music. Hell, I eventually learned and accepted that great works can have critiques and criticisms that are justified and worthy of discussion, and that nothing is 100% pure. An idea idea that back in the day would have given me a lot of anxiety. And I accept this now, even to the point that it has influenced my overall review style, because it's okay to love something even despite its faults, even if those said problems are the f***ing Eagles. Because after a lot of work with therapists and medication and just doing my best to improve my mental health outlook, I was able to manage my thoughts and obsessions rather than them managing me. For the first time in a long time, I was in the driver's seat of my own mind. And with that, that was the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like rating, share, subscribe, ring the bell, and leave a comment telling me what you thought of this video essay. Also, please consider checking out my Patreon page. $1 a month gets you onto this credit sequence, and $5 a month allows you to make requests for movies that I should watch and talk about on the Riley and Friends podcast. The link to my Patreon is in the description. And speaking of Patreon, I just want to thank my patrons, particularly my high tier ones in Samantha Devlin, Mom, and Morgan. Thank you so much for supporting what I do. Love y'all.